Well, welcome everyone. It's Alberto Vargas. I'm the Associate Director of LASIS, and it's our pleasure to receive our speaker today, Lola Loustaunau, from our own School for Workers here at UW-Madison. Lola received a bachelor's in political science from the University of Buenos Aires and a master's and PhD from the University of Oregon, and she has had several leadership positions in many different places, and she's here to share with us the results of her research about labor work in the Northwest.
Yes, thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Lola.
much.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Sorry for that delay in getting started. I'm really happy to be here, sharing a little bit of my work with the LASIS community and with all of you. So the research that I'm going to be sharing today, it's like a little piece of a broader project. But basically today I'm going to be discussing a series of wildcat strikes led by migrant women working in the fruit packing industry in Yakima, Washington. And during 2020, basically, to discuss basically how the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated a pre-existing crisis of social reproduction. And in that, it kind of revealed the intertwined nature between productive and reproductive work, between labor precarity and a care crisis, right? Between struggles for working conditions and struggles for living conditions in a broader sense. So I follow basically workers' testimonials, and I mobilize social reproduction theory, right, to return to the factory. And then my goal is to unpack how migrant women really spearheaded and sustained the strikes while building a community of care at the factory doors. So I move away from a more kind of traditional analysis of power resources to try to explain collective action, trying to shed light on how attention to the central role of migrant women in the factory, the home, and the community really reveals a network of affective experiences, right, that really influence worker behaviors, the strategies they use in their collective organizing, and the outcomes, basically bringing forward really how collective action arouses among those considered less likely to organize. So really, I think these workers' experiences prompt us to consider novel ways in which community building and workplace organizing really manifested during this global crisis, and how, well, it can serve us to think about future and ongoing crises. So actually, let me move to this slide. I actually wanted to start the presentation with this slide because this is it's a picture from the strikes, and you can see there's one of the workers holding a sign that says "Nuestro trabajo es vida." I can't admit people. Right, and I think it really captures part of the argument that I'm trying to make, right? I think this design, Nuestro trabajo es vida, our workers' life, really points to this interconnection between the production of commodities and the social production of life in a more general way, right? And in this case particularly, it calls attention to the work that these women who spend 10, 12, 14 hours a day cleaning, packing, cutting fruits that are consumed all over the world have been doing, right? They really work long hours for minimum wage with no benefits, doing backbreaking work, and then return home to take care of their families, right? Their work really ensures that other workers are fed, but they themselves, struggle to put food on their tables. So I think that the struggles led by these women really serves to reveal, as I was saying, kind of this interplay between commodity production and social reproduction at different levels, right? And that we can better understand why these workers walked out when they did, and the actions they took if we pay attention to this relation. So I think, again, as I was saying, I think in these struggles, we see a relation between social reproduction as what I would call, and others have called, kind of the societal level, right? Because they are part of the production of food at a mass scale. But, food that really requires, increased pre-processing time, right? Work time that have increased for workers in general, right? That find less time available back in their homes to devote to their own social reproductive activities. So this women's kind of like extra labor in the factories in some ways subsidizes the increased hours of work faced by people in a broader sense who have less and less time to cook at home, prepare meals, and increasingly consume more and more pre-processed goods, pre-clean, cut, peel, right? But they are doing this work in the middle of a crisis of their own, right? On a crisis of their ability to work is based on a series of very precarious arrangements, right? That leave kind of an underlying crisis of social reproduction unresolved. So as I will explain in some more detail in just a moment, right? I think that returning to the factory with a social reproduction theory lens gives us other important clues about how to understand strikes and how to understand specifically the organizing that took place in this series of strikes by pointing to the ways in which basically the social reproduction crisis moved from a more latent to an open form during the COVID-19 pandemic and became part of this open crisis of social reproduction becomes the catalyst for the strikes. So let me back up momentarily and hopefully. Okay. Okay, it's not moving my slides, Sarah. I don't know why. So hopefully you'll get my slide in a moment. Oh, I don't know. Okay, so let me back up and explain a little bit of the background of the area, the industry, and kind of like the methods of this research. So Washington State is really a leading producer of apples in the United States. They produce 70% of the apples of the United States, and really Yakima Valley, the place where this research is located, is the largest apple producing region in Washington, with a really high concentration of packing and processing plants. There's over 12,000 workers employed in these plants presently, and they're all involved in this task of like cleaning, cutting, peeling sometimes, and packing fruit. Not only apples, cherries, pears as well, right? Again, most fruit and vegetable production in the United States is in some way seasonal, but which means that their large harvests are occurring in the summer and in the fall, but employment in the packing houses is year round. So although there's like some augmentation of like labor needs during the summer and the fall, they continue packing, cleaning, and processing year round. For example, there's like for a very long time, actually, historically, this work has been done by migrant workers in Washington State. For example, among graders and sorters of apples, almost 60% of the workforce is foreign-born, comparatively to 15% of foreign-born workers in other industries and in the United States, right? So a huge difference. And the work, particularly in packing houses and in fruit canneries, has been feminized for quite some time now, unlike meat packing, who has, for example, been mostly a male-dominated industry, although that's been changing. Canneries have had a majority women in their production, and usually migrant women. Maybe some of you remember the work of Pazzavella on Chicanas and Mexican American women in cannery houses in the 1930s, in the 1970s in California, and it's the same case for Washington State. And I also included here a map of the COVID case count. I know this sounds a little weird now in 2024, but I think it really shows how, despite the small population that Yakima Valley has, it really became, it had the largest head count of cases in the whole state really quickly, and most of the outbreaks were happening in these packing houses. And this is important to keep in mind as we're trying to understand the catalyst for this series of wildcat strikes. Yeah, so again, just I don't want to take a lot of time here, but I was already doing a lot of research in food processing when the pandemic started and then when the strike started. And at the beginning, I was like interacting with the workers remotely. And then eventually I was able to start traveling and be part of the actions that they were engaging in. So most of the work that I'm presenting is based on in-depth interviews. And like I analyze them as testimonials. But at the same time, I also did a lot of participant observation at like rallies, meetings, other worker-led actions. I was in picket lines with them. I also did a focus group with the organizing committee of the strike a year after the strikes happened, kind of to reflect back on what had happened and how they were looking forward to their action and their continued engagement with the community. And I also did like a FOIA request of all the complaints presented by workers to all the different employers that they struck against, right? So this was over 200 complaints presented not only to OSHA, but also to the Wage and Hour Division and to other health officials. So I analyzed and compiled all that data as well. And here you have some also demographic information of who the workers are. So this specific section is based on 25 in-depth interviews, and in the focus group, 8 workers participated. And of course, the majority were women. The majority of them had dependents. And as you can see, I think there's a couple things I find that are maybe important. I speak about migrant workers, but there were like a variety of migratory statuses that included citizens, most of them second generation. And it was something interesting that was happening at the plants is that a lot of mothers and daughters work together, and so a lot of the younger citizens that were interviewed were actually direct relatives of some of the older workers who had other more precarious migratory statuses. Yeah, and I can talk more about methods and that later if people are interested. And again, here I also won't go into a lot of detail, but I just wanted to make some broad points about the working conditions, which again, in the food industry have been historically poor, right? So we're talking about long and physically demanding workdays, unpredictable schedules, low wages, a really high accident rate. I don't think a lot of people are aware of how high the accident rate is in this subsector of manufacturing. And again, workers also spoke about really poor and violent treatment by supervisors and managers, sexual harassment, a constant threat of dismissal, and working in a lot of pain. And I think this is also really important to highlight because of the demanding work that they were asked physically to do, the long hours, and for the most, the lack of any protective equipment and the lack of any attention to an ergonomic facilitation of the work, right? So, for example, the lines were really high for most of the workers, just to give an example. So at the same time, and this is what I think it's important and what I'm trying to make the argument around, is that these workers were really struggling to make work and make life work. Because again, this very extended and unpredictable schedules really prevented them from meeting their social reproduction obligations, being able to care for their children. And they were also facing rising costs of care, rising cost of housing, and rising cost of food, right? So many had to move further and further away from the packing plants, sometimes driving an hour to their workplace. And again, suffering sleep deprivation, sometimes car accidents directly linked to that sleep deprivation because of again, having to live far away. And I think that these conditions, coupled with a lack of safety net in the United States that is particularly lacking for migrant workers, really a really expensive and expulsive healthcare system, right, really created the conditions for what others and I also call, right, an ongoing crisis of social reproduction. So this is where I think that, as I was saying earlier, returning to the factory with a social reproduction theory lens becomes really important. So I think that a lot of research on work and working conditions, really, and organizations actually have, imagined that the perfect worker for the employer as this unencumbered worker, right? A white man with no social reproduction responsibilities, right? This is like the ideal worker. And I kind of want to argue that for the case of this particularly degraded kind of food sweatshops, right, these forgotten factories of food production, the ideal worker are the one that is seeked out, but also reproduced by the very conditions on the shop floor. It's a very vulnerable worker with a lot of social reproductive responsibilities that become kind of as an external and also internal form of labor discipline. Because those social reproductive responsibilities are in part what force these women to come back to the shop floor again and again, despite those degraded working conditions, right? So the ideal worker for this factory is a worker with a very limited labor market mobility and with really heavy social reproductive burdens. And it appeared a lot in the conversations with a lot of the women that were saying, like, for example, men don't last here, right? Who stays on the line? Who can put up with this work? Who can put up with this working conditions? And they would all articulate it's us, and we have to do this. We have a family to take care of, right? So I think that at the same time, as I'm saying this, and as I'm saying that the social reproductive responsibilities operate in some way as a form of labor discipline, I'm going to also make the case that when the crisis became more open during the pandemic, it also became a catalyst for action in the workplace and for resistance, right? And again, it's let me show you. Sorry, this was supposed to be the slide that you were seeing. Right, and Angie here, one of the leaders of the strikes, kind of making this connections all the time between how essential they were actually in their homes, not in the workplace, despite being called essential, in order to force them to continue working, right? But what I wanted to go to now is this quote, right, by Maribel, and this is a conversation. She's rehashing a conversation they had with the plant manager at one of the factories the day before the first strike began, because these were a series of strikes in 7 different plants. And again, here what she's naming is that it's a situation in which the COVID-19 pandemic becomes what she calls la gota que derramó el vaso, right? And which we just translate in English as the stroke that broke the camel's back. But actually the image in Spanish is a little more telling, because it's about a drop of water that makes the glass spill over. And that was a little bit of what happened for these workers. The glass was already very full. They were making it work, but this, again, is a movement from a latent to like an open crisis of social reproduction. And I think here she's also explaining, right, a lot of how the employer was kind of using this idea that they had the responsibility of feeding everyone, and that's why they needed to keep working. And again, kind of highlighting the role that these women have ensuring social reproduction at a societal level, but at the same time, like, also pointing out to the fact that they couldn't afford groceries, and that's why they needed to return to buy in small increments because of the low wages that they had, right? And again, I think that what Maribel and others like express is that, this was just like, it was a compounding of coexisting crises, and that created, again, a breaking point, right? A crisis of care, a crisis of time, an endemic precarity that they had faced as migrant workers in these packing plants. So actually, the very next day of this conversation, which, Maribel was part of a group that went to the manager after several attempts of trying to let them leave, basically, let them leave the plants, let them stay home, or offering some form of way of like reducing the amount of people in the plant, things that probably we all kind of like forgot a little bit about, but we knew very well back in 2020 about what workers were demanding, right? So the next day, through WhatsApp, 100 workers of the morning shift, like overnight, organized, and they all walked out. 100% compliance. And for those of us who study strikes and collective organizing, getting 100% out is quite a feat. Like, it's not that easy to achieve, right? And they were able to do that on WhatsApp overnight. And basically, the first day, they were demanding better wages, they were demanding better treatment, they were demanding safety, but they, as we'll see, they were making really broad demands. Like, they were using the point of production, they were using that space of confrontation with the employer to actually make really, really broader demands about for their community, not just for themselves as workers. So after this first plant walked out, I think it was like 2 days later, another plant joined, and soon, then it was 100 workers and 200 workers, and 400 workers actually walking out in 6 different plants, and then a final 7th plant that joined them. And not only that, the strike, the one that lasted the longest, which was the first company, and they stayed for 25 days on a wildcat strike. That's also a very significant amount of time to stay on a picket line with no support, again, no organization, no union that I was actually leading. It was just like the self-organization of the workers. And also 3 different orchids. So it spread to the fields. So field workers were actually doing the apple picking, also were, compelled by what they were seeing, the people in the packing plants doing, and also join at different times the strike. So again, as I was saying, it really spread, and you can see that, this is just some of the quotes that, just to bring some of the voices of the actual workers and what they were saying, right? And the arguments were very similar, and I interviewed people in all the different companies that struck. So, they were really explicitly connecting factory, house, community, right? And they were, again, using this workplace strike to this demand at the point of production, to make broader demands for their communities. And, you can see this is another of the workers, Jessica, kind of articulating like a combination of a broader understanding of their role and the importance of their work, with a direct connection with the need for political education, and also with the task of caring for each other. And this is going to be very significant in the type of actions that the workers did, which I am turning to next. Right. So I think once outside the plants, workers really move beyond just, rejecting, kind of like the crude disposability that they were facing, and really engage in more expensive forms of collective action. Outside of the plants, without the rush of production, without the noise of the machines, the controlling gaze of the managers, workers were really able to make time to tell each other stories, for sharing what they knew about the ongoing situation, but also for piecing together fragments of broader stories about the organizing that had happened decades before in the plants, learning about struggles like in the broader area, not just in the packing plants. So, outside the plants, also, they were no longer invisible. These workers became political actors that were visible to like a variety of other stakeholders, right? So all of a sudden, they were representatives from the community and from labor organizations, right? Lawyers, activists, academic researchers, joining them in the picket lines, right? Journalists trying to contribute to this ongoing conversation, right? So I think as a result of this convergence, like Las Huelgas, really became spaces kind of like to get a grassroots labor education, right? Picket lines were improvised classrooms, discussions about workers' rights, the history of the Bracero program, feminism in Latin America, honestly, very raw conversations, how to build a union, right? All of a sudden, were happening every day. And referring to this process, Angie, another of the workers, says, thanks to the strike, I'm not the same Mensa as before, right? I'm not the same fool, so they are screwed. Now I got some education, I know more. Before they could get their way, I was more afraid, but not anymore. Right. But what's important is that workers also created other spaces, right? One of the important things they did, and you see a picture, let me share here, you see a picture that was taken by Edgar Franz, which is an organizer also with a farm worker union in Washington State. They were creating altares, for example, for the dead, right? Altares de los muertos. And I think what's interesting about the things that they were doing is that they were creating, for example, space for grieving and mourning, which there was no space anywhere, right? Workers were denying, like employers were denying that space. The government was normalizing the amount of deaths that were occurring, right? They were really trying to create spaces for other things. So for education, for conversations, time to spend with their children. But they also were like understanding that they could, pull together to like help each other, pay for expenses, to fund actually that strike that they were doing, and to support each other, people who had family members that were sick. Right. So these initial actions really allow workers to extend the same logic of collective care to other needs that they were facing, right? So again, Angie said, we realized we could help each other when someone was sick or if they had suffered an injury, that we could bring each other food, help each other with childcare, and collect money to help each other buy medicine. But so what I think is particularly interesting about the experience of these workers is that while they were, in a picket line, a classic like labor action, and they were doing all this like kind of community building, creating other spaces, they were also, still demanding things from the state, from the government, from the employers. So this, let me show you, these are just some like screenshots from the complaints that I told you that I did a FOIA request for. And what I think it's important is, the way in which labor enforcement works in the United States, which is like, kind of complaint-based, in which workers need to file individual like claims, individual complaints about what they think is wrong in their workplace. Well, they kind of subverted this logic because they were in the picking lines all together, writing together about why things need to change in the workplace, and sending that to OSHA, like kind of like filling up OSHA's like box with this kind of collectively written complaints, although this is not a collective process, right? And at the same time, I think it's important to think, right? Like, of course, strikes are organizing spaces, right? And workers were like, okay, let's start a union. But let's start an independent union, right? And they were being supported by other farm worker independent organizations in the state. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now, and they faced a lot of union busting, a lot of retaliation. A lot of their leaders were fired, right? And they had little recourse. And even though like it was a very intense like union busting campaign, and ultimately their attempt of gaining representation, at least in one of the companies, failed, right? They failed, that they lost that election. And, the NLRB, the National Labor Review Board, kind of accepted later on that the employer had violated the law, but by then, a lot of the workers had lost their jobs. So it was harder to like pick up that particular strategy and that particular avenue. But what's interesting is that workers were not set back by that. They actually were like, this doesn't matter. We're a union regardless, because we're a union that goes, it's broad. What we're trying to do is broader than getting legal representation in one particular company. So what they did is they put some resources and they rented a small office in like downtown Yakima to be able to continue hosting meetings and labor workshops and other things like vaccination clinics when vaccines became available, right? And I actually went to Yakima a couple of times to be part of this vaccination clinics. And it was really interesting, right? Because of course, again, neither employers, not specifically like the local government, were organizing any of this directed to these workers, to these migrants, mostly Spanish speaking workers. And it was the women who had led the strikes who were now organizing this. And these events were, again, community events. They were not just open to packing or processing workers, right? So kind of like dislocating like a traditional membership to a union and just like opening it up way broader way to the community. And of course, no papers were required, no documentation to participate or to access any of the resources that they were offering. Kind of practicing what some like organizers in Spain have called ciudadanía instead of ciudadanía, right? And in this Cuidadanía, what they were doing was like providing food, providing free childcare, providing spaces for kids to play and to learn, continuing conversations about workplace organizing and workers' rights, again, like in a broader way, and conversations about what does it look like to take care of each other in this context? How do we take care of each other as a community? And they had local DJs and tacos, and it was like a party too, right? Like there were a lot of things going on in these spaces. So again, I have here, oh, sorry, it's like the double, right? And I think that also what happened, what a lot of workers mentioned, and this is traditional perhaps of many strikes, and we forget because particularly in the United States, strikes have become less and less common. Huelgas have become less and less common. How they become moments of really transformative and organizing moments for those who are able to take part of them. And I didn't go into a lot of detail here, but most of these workers had zero organizing experience or even like knowledge of what it would look like to organize a workplace action. Not all of them. Some had been part of some, marginally part of some organizing before. For the most, they didn't, right? And this idea that it was like night and day, right? That it changed even like the emotions that workers were feeling in their workplace and beyond. Okay, so just to conclude, to have a little bit of time for conversation, I want to return to some of my thoughts on how looking at the relation between kind of productive and reproductive labor can help us better understand the role these very precarious women had in leading these work struggles, but also in building this like kind of community space that allowed for access to resources and to caring for each other, basically, right? Because sometimes I think we talk about the community as if it already existed, but you kind of have to build it, and that's what they did. So in some ways, we know that like kind of the division between the social reproduction and commodity production is an artifact of capitalism, if you will, right? And production and reproduction are co-defined by each other in many ways. And of course, like the crisis of social reproduction impacts the space of commodity production. There's no way it cannot impact it, right? And I think that, the importance of this role that women play and what they express, because they were making those links visible constantly in their struggles, in their articulation of what the issues were, and the solutions that they were asking for those issues, right? And again, this idea of like the moment of the pandemic as this like open, like of a movement from a latent to an open crisis of social reproduction, or even like a crisis of capitalist life, if you will. I think again, like that the pandemic served to reveal kind of this fictitious nature of like kind of old and new dichotomies that compartmentalize, productive and non-productive work, reproductive work, and really, again, like show the centrality of reproductive labor for sustaining life and for sustaining all other work. And again, this reproductive work that is not just the work that is done in the household, it's also the work done in some factories that are central to social reproduction at large. And I think that we can think again as collective action as a social process that is kind of like activated and deactivated by a multiplicity of factors, right? That is partially structural for sure. And it's integral, it's related to the labor process, if you will. But it's also depending on kind of like this broader existing social environmental factors, and workers' relation to reproductive labor. And that's why women and their centrality, both in the factory and in the home and in the community, made them this kind of bridge of all the worlds that were so central for the struggles. Women struggle inside and outside the factories, right? They demanded better wages, but they also wanted an acknowledgement of the crisis, of the rising cost of living, of food. They wanted safety measures, but they also wanted vaccines for their community. They wanted paid time off while sick, right? But they were making demands that were like broader. They wanted safety regulations for all workers, not just for themselves, right? They wanted resources for their community. So I think that, just to close, we can say that capital kind of persistently devours the very supports on which it relies, right? But that the crisis that moved these workers to action is not just like a limit that is imposed by kind of like the logic of capital, but it has a destabilizing potency, right? The crisis of social reproduction is not just like about relying on the social contradiction of capitalism, but it's a window of opportunity for collective action. And these are some more pictures.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Julia from Germany. I was wondering what happened after this. The big question that always comes when one done something.
I know.
That happened in this moment of like community or communitas, as like this concept anthropology says as well, liminality and stuff like that happening. And what happens then after? And I was also wondering about the reaction from the other side, or like the center of power, like the owners of the factory, and strategies like divide and conquer when they encounter this kind of organization, like workers or unions. So maybe you can share some insights.
Absolutely. And I shared just a little bit, right? Because actually, like I was on the field with them for over 2 years. So I actually saw some of things unfold, and I was talking to some of them recently. And okay, so this is some disorganized thoughts on this, and like I'll tell you a story. So as I was saying, like one of the strategies they took was try to organize a traditional union in one of the workplaces. One of the factories that first started. And again, it was a long kind of traditional union campaign, but instead of going with like a established union, they tried to start their own union. Some of them had bad experiences with existing unions. The problem with that is that they had limited resources, and employers did a very intense, again, union busting campaign. So they fired some of the organizers. Others, what they did is they put them in really dangerous positions on the line, and 2 of them actually got injured really fast. And then they were out of the line, right? Because they so they kind of like this, like they really went after the organizing committee, which was comprised of like 7 women and 1 man, basically. And like they really, went after them. So that, and by the time they went to election, they lost that election. So that was the first thing. They lost the election. Eventually, the NLRB ruled that the employer had acted illegally. But by then, workers felt that they didn't have the capacity to go through that again, because it was pretty violent. They really had like a really bad time. Like some of the things that the employer would do is, these plants are like on roads. There's no parking except the private parking owned by the companies. So they wouldn't allow them. They didn't have anywhere even to leave their cars. Like at some point they started parking in a school that was like a mile away. And then the employers called the school district to ensure that they couldn't park in the school parking. And this is so school wasn't even in this by that time was summer. So it's not like the school was working, but again, still. So that was really brutal. They still kept, I think they shut down the office recently. So they kept, they had some funding, mostly coming from donations from other organizations that existed in the state and beyond. They are part of like the Food Workers Alliance, which is like a broader network of food workers. And through that, they, again, like what they did is like, okay, we'll be a charter of that regardless of whether we have union representation. They continue doing activities. I think for about 2 years after they lost the union election, which is not bad, I would say, because they all had to go find work at different places, they all stay in the industry for the most. Eventually, what I think is kind of interesting too is some of the main leaders actually became kind of community organizers in other organizations. And I think this is not that uncommon, right? And like that when worker leaders emerge and then organizations kind of like, okay, try to bring them in and try to have a space for them, for that to become kind of their full-time work, to be organizers in some way. So some of them became full-time organizers. And I am like kind of split on what I think about that. In some ways, I think that it's good because, for them, like they are doing, they learn to do this work and they're really engaged, and now they're out there in the community trying to organize more workers. In some ways, it's not that great because it basically removed them from the space in which they were trying to do that organizing, right? So there's tensions. I think that other labor scholars here in the room would agree with me that there's tensions about, the impacts of that. So yes, I would say, and employers, this employer, the one that they were organizing, was the worst one, and he hauled out, and they got some short-term good outcomes. So in the short term, they actually got a raise, some better protections, etc. But after they lost the union election, all of that went away. Because the employer also used it to see, we can give you this without the need of a union, right? Although it had given it to them because they had done the strike. So again, and some employers were smarter and they caved more quickly and provided some of the things that workers were asking more quickly to bring them back in. And then also another thing that a lot of these employers have been doing and are implicitly doing is hiring temporary guest workers. So all the workers, although they were migrant workers, and for the most, none of them had what's an H-2B visa, right? And the move to H-2B visas creates some complexities for workers because H-2B workers are less likely, they're not there year-round, and they're less likely to engage in collective organizing because of the limitations of the visa program they're in. And I think that's what, plants have become increasingly reliant on that type of labor. And that was a way of reducing also collective action. So I guess not great, but good in some ways. I mean, I do think it changed the community. You know what I mean? I did think a lot of it really transformed a lot of workers' own histories, but yeah.
There's some in the chat too.
Oh, sorry. Can you explain more about social reproduction theory, and name a few benefits and challenges of forming an independent union? And were certain conspiracy theories disrupting sometimes anti-vax theories? Oh, and the autism. Okay, so let's start with the independent union. I'll leave social reproduction theory for last. So the independent union, I think it was really important for workers to try to go independent. I think some of them had been part of meatpacking plants, particularly had a series of I mean, there's a lot of rich labor history in that area of Washington and a lot of back and forth and a lot of struggles, but for the most, they had been pretty dismissive of Latinx workers and migrant workers in general and Spanish-speaking workers. And they had really failed to organize them. And what happened is that there's a farm worker union called Familias Unidas por la Justicia, which still exists. They are a really successful case of independent farm worker organizing in Washington state. And they were the ones who were doing most of the support to the packing workers. And they were the ones who were already an independent union and brought that model to them. And workers were really they saw themselves in was way more affinity, way more connections with those workers. And to be frank, I don't think any other union, really attempted to organize them at this point. It wasn't like a big union was trying to come in and organize them in any way. They had tried 20 years before, actually. So the FCW had tried to organize those packing plants 20 years before and had failed, but yeah. So conspiracy theories, well, not so much at the organizing level, right? Like they all wanted protection. And at the moment, the first moments of organizing, vaccines weren't out yet, right? So they were just worried. And again, I think that the women were just, it was the crisis that they were that was happening for them in their homes and at the workplace, just, it was just really, really unbearable. So I think at that point, that wasn't a problem. I think later on, it became a problem. I think later on, we had, they were doing, not the organizing committee. I think the organizing committee was really interested in bringing vaccines to the community, but they did have to have a lot of complicated conversations, and there was a lot of resistance, but I think they were really good advocates to bring more packing workers and more agricultural workers into that clinic and into that space to get the vaccines. I went there a couple of times, and I would say that we would have 400 people come by, right? But half of them were looking for the vaccine, and half of them, and the majority of them, wanted the food resources that the workers were giving. Like they had like grocery store gift cards, and they had food there, and they had a lot of PPE, and workers also wanted that. So yeah. And social reproduction theory, and the way that I am discussing it, and like maybe some people who are more curious and are thinking about something else, but social reproduction theory, I'm bringing like Titi Bhattacharya's, Nancy Fraser's way of understanding basically the relation between kind of commodity production, or like, production for profit, value production, and like, again, reproduction at social reproduction at 3 different levels. The idea of reproduction of society at large, and then of the activities of daily reproduction. And also it's about reproduction through birth, right? Like the activity of giving birth. That's also social reproduction. I think part of the theory, and this is why I'm kind of subverting it, right? Because the idea of the theory, as many other feminist like scholars, is like to kind of shift our attention from the factories to other spaces of work, right? In some ways, like some scholars have been concerned with trying to understand like teacher strikes, right? Teacher organizing, or like or nurses organizing, two activities that can also be considered part of social reproduction, like education and health, right? Activities that are not necessarily producing like a particular commodity, but what they're producing is this capacity of caring for each other, although they can be for profit, right? Of course, not always. But I think that my whole point is that, and they want to, again, bring attention also to activities in the home. And this is part of the discussions about domestic labor, for example, right? That coming from the 70s and so forth, about like the value or not value of domestic labor, kind of wages for housework discussion, etc. But in this case, what I'm saying is like, okay, like if social reproduction theory helps us understand like the importance of how social reproduction work, which can be, again, for profit or not, sustains all other work. What if we, with some of those insights about the particular role of women in doing that labor, we go back to a traditional factory setting. We go back to a production process, but with this like kind of renewed understanding of the connections and of the importance of social reproductive activity for sustaining life. And we go back to a factory that's producing food. I think it allows us to see things that we weren't seeing before. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about that. But I'm open to comments on that too. That's like, that's me testing things, basically. I do, I have to teach a class.
35, so maybe we have time for one more brief.
Yeah, or comment.
Yeah.
Brief question along after. No.
Yeah.
I guess I know this wasn't like a highlight of your research, but I'm curious, like, given that this is in Washington, if there were a large population of like Canadian immigrants that may have impacted this community, or was it like very like migratory chain from the South?
Oh no, this Yakima has been, it's a majority Latinx area, and it's been for many years now. So this is like not although the migration chains continue, this is not new migration. So most folks have been there for a long time, actually. I think like agricultural production and food processing in Washington, in Oregon, has been very dependent on migrant labor since always, kind of, with some changes of who are the workers. So like, and it depends a little bit on the subsector. So like in the coast for like fish processing, which I also studied, at some point it was more Asian migration, but like way back when. But now for, since the 60s till now, it's mostly, and there was like, a huge part of the Bracero program. And that's kind of what's interesting of what some of the workers found out, that their relatives have been part of the Bracero program. And maybe it's like they didn't even know, they hadn't even had those conversations in their homes, but they were having those conversations like outside in the picket lines, and they were learning and then like calling their like grandparents, like, were you part of this? Why didn't you ever tell me? Right? And kind of like recapturing kind of some lost family histories, which I also thought was really And you know, I remember this one worker, Armida, she like told a story about how she realized that her dad had been part of the Bracero program. And as she was learning the type of conditions they faced, she had this conversation, and her dad just sharing that, you know, it was too humiliating for him to share, and that he had never shared kind of the sacrifices he had done. And yeah, and they were both like, yeah, like very moved, and like by the fact that she was now, you know, kind of continuing a very similar work to the one he did, but kind of fighting to change it. Yeah. But yeah, those are some of the stories that like literally kind of appear in the picket lines. I have others, like, yeah, like I'll quickly share one more, which I think is really interesting. Maribela of the workers, she was really, really young when they had tried to organize for the first time with this attempt, I was saying, at UCW in like the late 90s. I think she was like 17. And she was working, you know, without authorization. She was really young, and her aunts were in the same plant, but they were older. And she thought that she had lost that employment because the union had won, because that's what the employer had said. And she had spent 20 years thinking that that's what had happened. And then in the picket line, her aunt, who's now older, comes and joins her in like the struggle. And her aunt had been leading the unionization attempt like in the 90s. And they also have a conversation in which Maribel finally understands that no, that she lost her employment because the union lost, not because the union won. And the union lost, and they got rid of a lot of the workers, right, to try to decrease the chances of like the organizing being successful if they tried again. So yeah, those are just some of the things that happen in the picket line that I thought were really important and kind of interesting to share. Yeah.
Did electoral politics kind of come up in this, in at any point during the organizing or after that community space?
I mean, I think some of the leaders then kind of like increased their connections to some of like, there was a representative, a local representative who is a Latina and who was in the Democratic Party, and like she kind of like approached them and was available. So there were, and like, again, like this is Washington, this is a very progressive state, right? And even in that area, which is less progressive, because Eastern Washington is less progressive for sure, it's still like the overarching like politics of the state were kind of progressive, democratic leaning. I think workers were, you know, I think they were being told that they needed to care about that by other community organizations that were pushing them into some like electoral politics, particularly, you know, the 2020 election. So they did that, some of that labor. I don't think that's what they thought it was more important. But they kind of did it, right? Yeah. Well, thank you all of you. Thank you for coming.